trust, uh, how do you, I mean, what does your typical workday at Microsoft looks like?
Well, my role at Microsoft is to manage a team that includes a number of functions, including our digital crimes unit that works to combat cybercrime around the globe, and our teams that, a relatively new team that we formed, the Digital Threat Analysis Center, that looks at all of the threat intelligence we have at Microsoft and provides context around that threat intelligence to understand where are the threats coming from, what are the motivations of the threat actors, and what can we do as a global community to counter cybersecurity threats. So my daily routine is a combination of typical management work, but increasingly engaging in very specific instances where there are either significant cybercrime or nation-state threats, and working with others across the company on helping protect our customers against those.
We have been discussing Ukraine a lot, and in terms of also the role of technology companies, but also the use of cyber operations in the Ukraine conflict. How do you think this use of cyber and other kinds of tech elements in this conflict is going to have implications for the stability of cyberspace, as well as the things such as hybrid warfare?
I have to apologize. I had difficulty hearing the question, so let's try one more time to make sure I get it.
So how do you look at the use of cyber operations in the Ukraine conflict? What kind of implications it has for the cyber and the hybrid conflict, as well as for the stability of the cyberspace in general?
Well, I think in our view that what we've seen happening in Ukraine is a harbinger of things to come that are threatening and concerning, because what we've seen is the true first significant hybrid war occurring in Ukraine, where we see both cyber weapons utilized in concert and in coordination with kinetic weapons. And as that conflict has continued on, we've seen that pattern replicate itself many different times. Most recently, as you've probably seen in the press, we've seen that the Ukrainian energy supply has been the target of kinetic attacks. And at the same time, we've seen many attacks against energy supply companies, utilities, and the like, as cyber attacks. And that's just the most recent example. We saw the same thing just a few weeks ago in water supply, where dams were being bombed at the same time there were cyber attacks against water supply utilities. Previously to that, it was the IT sector, or especially media, and a combination of both cyber and kinetic attacks against media companies. And so it's been an ongoing clear association of cyber attacks and kinetic attacks in a strategically aligned way. And the pattern's repeated so many times that it's clear that there's designed intent and strategy behind that. And what it shows us is, as we've all known for some time, that cyber weapons can have significant impact. Now we're seeing that combined with kinetic, and the history of conflict and warfare teaches us that when you see a new domain of conflict utilized, whether that's a new weapon system or a new domain of conflict, like in the First World War, the movement into the air, and then by the time of the Second World War, how far that had advanced in terms of its impact. We anticipate, unfortunately, the same thing happening with this, the first real hybrid combination of cyber and kinetic, unfortunately, is likely to mean that we will see more of that in the future as other nation states engage in conflict.
One of the other things that we're also discussing in the Ukraine conflict is the tech neutrality, the role of technology companies shedding their neutrality. And on the other hand, we've also seen these calls being made for accountable tech companies. You think for companies like Microsoft, it's important to focus on tech neutrality, or do you think they have other important things such as protecting the individual users for online harms, protect the critical infrastructure, and those kind of things?
So Microsoft has a very clear view on this, which is it's our obligation, we feel it's a social obligation that we have to protect the digital ecosystem as a whole. And we do that by taking steps to protect our customers. But beyond our customers, my organization primarily focuses on how can we make the digital ecosystem safer, more trusted by all users, whether they're our customers or not. So as we combat cybercrime, we combat all forms of cybercrime. When we work to combat nation-state activities in cyberspace, it's not with regard to our customers. In particular, you see that in terms of our activities in Ukraine, where we've been working to protect and defend against the cyber attacks that we see. And some people say, well, Tom, but you're not doing the same thing in Russia. Well, of course, there are economic sanctions to which we are compelled to comply that restrict what we can do in Russia. And in this case, most of the cyber activity that we're seeing is targeting Ukraine and Ukraine infrastructure in any event. But we're taking a lot of steps, working closely to try to defend Ukraine against those attacks. At the same time, to the extent that we can, entirely consistent with the economic sanctions, we still have some cloud services that we provide to citizens in Russia. And we do that both because we believe it's a governmental function to determine the extent and nature of sanctions that should be applied. That shouldn't be a private sector function. And also because our services in Russia do support hospitals and healthcare organizations, education, and the ability for dissenters or others to organize and communicate. And so from a human rights perspective, we continue to provide those services. But at the same time, our focus is on defense against the cyber weapons. And that's a key part of our position relative to cyber conflict. We've publicly pledged, and we absolutely live by our pledge, that we will defend anyone against cyber attacks, but we will help no government conduct cyber attacks. So Microsoft is in the view that we will help you defend, but we will never help any government utilize cyber weapons in an offensive capability.
Interesting, but you think that it will be difficult for some of the other tech companies to regain the neutrality after the Ukraine conflict, now that they have shared the neutrality and being biased towards certain actors?
Well, I guess I would challenge the concept, at least for Microsoft, that we have shed neutrality or that we're biased towards any particular actor. Again, we're acting to defend against the attacks that we see, and we do that across all of our customers. So whenever we see a customer that has been attacked by any nation state, threatened or compromised by any nation state, and we have actionable threat intelligence to share, we notify the customer, and we do that regularly, thousands of times a year. We provide these notifications to customers all across the globe about the fact that they are under attack or have been threatened by a nation state actor, together with the threat intelligence they can use to identify that attack and defend against it. And this is just a very specific instance of that in the context of Ukraine. And so in our view at least, what we're doing in this context is doubling down on our view that we are about helping defend against cyber attack, but we won't help on the offensive side. That said, because of the nature of that attack, the sanctions that have been applied and so forth, the business case for technology companies in Russia has been significantly degraded. Because our capability to do business there has been prevented by sanctions, and Microsoft has taken the position that we won't sell any new products or services or subscriptions in Russia, at least during the course of the conflict. Once the conflict is over, then we, and I'm sure other technology companies, will be revisiting those kinds of issues. To what extent can we provide products and services in Russia will be something that will depend upon the resolution of the conflict and what legal restrictions we have and we're facing at that point.
Thank you. One of the other things that we have previously discussed in terms of cyber attacks is the difficulty in attributing the attack to a specific actor. What role can the tech companies such as Microsoft play to establish effective and clear attribution, which will help the responsible state actors to pin down the responsibility on the perpetrators?
So my team works closely with the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, which is our team that does track nation-state actors, does our investigations, and does our attributions. And we have an approach to doing nation-state cyber attribution that is very dependent upon ensuring that we get it right. Because it can sometimes be very challenging to ensure that you have high degree of confidence when you're making these attribution statements. So we aren't particularly motivated to be the first to make an attribution statement, and we've seen many instances in the past where those who make those attribution statements quickly can get them wrong. So our goal is to always make sure that we have high confidence in our conclusion whenever we do make an attribution statement. An example of that is in Ukraine, where after we saw sufficient evidence, we were able to make a clear attribution that the wiper malware that was being deployed had been developed by and was being deployed by a group we call Iridium that operates under the authority of Russian military intelligence. And that latter part, that it operates under the authority of Russian military intelligence, is not our conclusion, but it's the statement of other governments that that group is part of Russian military intelligence. And we've seen, all the evidence we've seen is consistent with that. But we always take the time to ensure that the evidence that we see confirms the conclusion before we publish it. On the other hand, over the last 5 years, since 5-6 years, and as I've been in this role, we've taken a position that we will publicly attribute when we see significant cyber attacks from any nation state. And that's because we believe that transparency is essential to fueling the conversation we need to continue to have as a global ecosystem around the enforceable rules of nation-state conduct in cyberspace. And so our digital diplomacy team, including Kaya, who was on the last panel, who leads that team, we're actively engaged in international conversations around what should be the policies of nation-state conduct in cyberspace, and how do we make that more broadly adopted, and how do we make those rules enforceable across all geographies. We think that doing public attribution provides a knowledge and information that will help those conversations be more robust and hopefully more productive in the long run. And we do the same thing for both cyber criminal activity as well as nation-state activity, and we will be publishing that more in the future. A good example is on November 4th, we will publish our 3rd annual Microsoft Digital Defense Report, which my team produces, and it compiles everything Microsoft is seeing across the cybersecurity landscape for the prior year. And this year's report is full of data and information about all forms of cybersecurity risks and our best advice for each chapter as to how enterprises, governments, and organizations can best defend against the increasing scope of cybersecurity risks.
Thank you. We are sitting in New Delhi. India is supposed to take over the presidency of G20 in the coming months. As someone who is, as a company which is involved in actively setting the norms for the cyberspace management, what role do you think there is for India to, in terms of shaping the norms for cyber space, responsible state behavior, those kind of things?
We think India has the opportunity to be very influential in advancing these conversations that I described and in contributing to cybersecurity, the ecosystem. There are a number of ways in which India has formulated policy relative to its cyber structure and architecture that we think could help advance the global conversation around privacy. As someone who's very invested in cybersecurity and recognizing the importance and the fundamental importance of privacy, I also recognize that we need to find the right balance, because if privacy restrictions unduly restrict the access that cybersecurity defenders need to data in order to provide meaningful security protection, then your privacy protections are really pretty thin, because they can be easily overridden by someone attacking and stealing your data and getting access to it in that way. So we need to find the right balance between privacy and security to provide the greatest trust and confidence in the digital ecosystem and protect individual rights. But India's role in that India has what we think is a very interesting approach to how it separates the role of controller and data owner. And we very much look forward to India's ongoing participation in that conversation as an example. Another place in which we could see India making a meaningful contribution to a challenge that we face across the ecosystem is on working with other governments to establish standards for the security of the supply chain. Supply chain security is a significant challenge, in part because we see adversaries doing very creative work to identify the most vulnerable participant in complex supply chains and conduct their cyber intrusions at that level. And then from there, they have a variety of techniques they can use to migrate up through the supply chain to their ultimate target. And whether that's to conduct espionage, gather data and information, steal intellectual property, or even stage potentially destructive malware in a critical infrastructure process or something is really relatively irrelevant. We know that adversaries are using those supply chain vectors as a key means of conducting their operations. And so getting to a common set of internationally recognized standards around supply chain, and it's very important that we have international consensus around those so that manufacturers and suppliers can comply with a common set of standards so that we have that confidence and trust in the supply chain. That's a dialogue in which India could make a meaningful contribution that needs a lot of international consensus that hasn't yet been reached. And I think there are other topics like that as India continues to grow its IT sector and become a global leader in technology, then that is going to give India a greater voice to participate in these cross-border conversations that need to happen. And hopefully those are multi-stakeholder conversations, because in the world of cybersecurity, much different from really any other domain of potential conflict, the private sector has to be included in those conversations. Government has unique and important roles that it must that it has to take on, but the private sector also has, because the internet is largely owned, developed, maintained, and secured by the private sector. Our participation in those conversations is critical to getting to meaningful solutions.
Let me press you on that role of private sector itself. What is the role that you foresee for the Indian IT sector in terms of addressing the cybersecurity vulnerabilities?
Well, I think in addition to the supply chain issues and how the Indian IT sector can participate in that, I think the Indian IT sector has the same role and responsibilities that any portion of the IT industry has, which is to actively participate, have their voice known, and help try to reach solutions. Another area, and especially when you're talking about vulnerabilities, is to help the industry evolve in ways that the security engineering continues to advance to minimize the opportunity for vulnerabilities. Now, the reality is, as you know, any significant software product or service is sufficiently complex from an engineering standpoint that incredibly well-resourced adversaries, nation states and cyber criminals, will continue to look for ways in which they can compromise those technologies. And what we've seen over the years is those compromises have moved away from simple engineering mistakes, data buffer overruns and things like that, into actually taking deliberately designed features and functionalities and finding ways to corrupt those features and functionalities and use them for a malign purpose rather than the purpose for which they were intended. And as we see more 0 days come about, often that's the category in which we see these vulnerabilities, is a feature or a function that the producer intended to have, but didn't recognize how that feature or function could be turned into a weapon for compromised purposes. So you need to patch it. India has a lot of commitment to and participation in the open source community. And that's a place where Microsoft is increasingly participating. We contribute to more open source products now than I think any other commercial company does, and we utilize a great deal of open source in our products. We need to work to develop together, and it's a place where the IT community in India can contribute to a greater culture of cybersecurity engineering in the open source community, because as you identify vulnerabilities in open source, you have to go back to the project owner, sponsor, get the corrections made that are necessary, and we need to continue to develop cybersecurity engineering as part of how open source development gets done. And so there's a whole range of ways in which the Indian IT community can be engaged in the international conversation that we need to have to improve the security of the ecosystem. And the best way to do that is to jump in and help.
Thank you. So let's open the floor for the audience questions. Please, yes, sir. First the gentleman in white t-shirt and then Sayu in the green. Only brief question. Please identify yourself also.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Wolfgang Kleinwächter. I'm a retired professor from Germany and a former ICANN board member. 5 years ago, Brett Smith, on behalf of Microsoft, proposed a digital Geneva Convention. So the idea then was discussed in many circles and was never implemented. Now, in the light of Ukraine, do you think there's time to rethink this approach? You meant standardization of supply chain, attribution, all these issues are unsolved. And a multi-stakeholder instrument would be probably helpful to move forward.
So we do believe that the world still needs the equivalent of a digital Geneva Convention, and whether you use that terminology or whether a different title is ascribed to this, but the notion that I described earlier about a set of rules that govern nation-state conduct in cyberspace in order to protect citizens, that's the concept of a digital Geneva Convention. And we utilize that terminology because of the Geneva Convention, especially the Fourth Geneva Convention's commitment to the protection of citizens in times of conflict. It's very focused, the Geneva Convention, as you know, it's very focused on, the harm to citizens from armed conflict. But we need the same set of rules and international consensus around those rules to protect citizens, organizations, and enterprises in cyberspace from nation-state conduct. And we need those rules to have sufficient international consensus, they become effectively enforceable. And just like, like many rules of international law, that enforceability is largely through consensus of the international community and the willingness of the international community to impose sanctions on those who do not abide by those consensus rules. And this is a great diplomatic challenge. It's one in which our team continues to actively participate in conversations with the United Nations through the Paris Call for trust and security in cyberspace, and in other ways. We continue to work because we believe that ultimately, if we are going to have the trust and security that we need collectively to have in cyberspace, we need to accomplish that set of agreement about those rules. We're not there yet. And that conversation, while we've had a lot of conversation, and we've seen some additional norms endorsed, and we've seen at least the United Nations redouble on its set of 2015 norms that it adopted, and it's still, in most recent activities, have said, yes, we still stand by that set of norms. There is still work to be done to get from that conversation to a stronger set of norms that has some concept of enforceability. So it's a great question. It's an effort that we're continuing to invest in and we still believe in.
Thank you. Gentlemen.
Thank you. My name is Surinder Singh. I used to work with Google and Dell, but at the moment I'm working as a carbon auditor with our tool services. My question has already been touched upon a bit by Mr. Patil, but the question is for you, Mr. Burt. Given the Ukraine example that we have now, how do you see the same scenario, God forbid if it may happen, given the complex geopolitical situation India is in, how do you think that the same cyberspace attacks or such a complex situation may come at the door of India, and how, if you may propose some examples of how we can go ahead and, let's say, address them, or rather prepare in advance? Thank you.
I have to apologize. There's some background noise, and it's making it very hard for me to hear.
Can you just state the questions briefly again?
The question is, after the Ukraine example that we have, you've already touched upon how the kind of the situation it was, cyberspace, and in India, how do you see if it may happen, or if you can propose some measures in case this same happens with India, how we can go ahead and work on it, and what the measure that, let's say, an Indian would probably think of? Thank you.
Yes, I think I got the question, and let me answer by trying to give you a few of the headline lessons that we've learned from what we've seen in Ukraine and how we think that translates to other potential conflicts in the future. And there's a couple of things. One is, you've heard from Microsoft, you've heard from our competitors about the security advantages of moving to the cloud. And what we've seen in Ukraine is that that is undeniably true. And it's clearly true in the way in which we think about it and we talk to customers about it, which is, in the cloud, we have the ability to provide greater security services and to provide you as the customer with better, more advanced tools to see the threats against your own environment and to respond to them in a much richer way, because it's powered by the capabilities that we can provide in the cloud that we can never provide on-prem. And we've seen that happen in Ukraine, and very specific examples of our technology. For example, a service we have called Defender for Endpoint, which is a cybersecurity service, cloud-based cybersecurity service. And we've seen instances of the AI technology in that service identifying wiper malware as it's coming into the environment, identifying it, blocking it, stopping it from ever being installed with zero human input whatsoever, all working as a cloud-based technology. And we can't provide that same robust cybersecurity on-prem. So that's one way in which we've seen confirmation of the security of the cloud. But the other one, which we didn't really anticipate, but it turns out to be very significant, and I've been talking about it a lot since we've learned about this, which is the physical security benefits of operating in the cloud. And we see many governments think about the sovereignty of their data and the sovereignty of the computing that they do to support government operations or critical infrastructure. And what we saw in Ukraine was one of the first missiles launched targeted the Ukrainian government data center. And the Ukrainian government at the time was entirely on premises. They did not have any cloud capabilities because the law prevented them from doing that. But within the first week of the war, President Zelensky signed a new legislation that enabled government ministries to move to the cloud. And we stepped in to help and moved 17 of 18 government ministries in a very short period of time, migrated them to the cloud. Because what Ukraine recognized was that by keeping all their computing on-prem and within Ukraine meant that the physical facility that enabled that computing became a target for their adversary. And moving to the cloud now distributes your data and your workloads into multiple data centers potentially outside your country. Your adversary doesn't know where to target, and your adversary would have to significantly increase the zone of the conflict in order to try to physically target that computing infrastructure. So there's both a logical and a physical security benefit to moving critical workloads, government services workloads, critical infrastructure workloads into the cloud when you think about the military defense. And in other conversations I've had, there was a real insight I heard from someone else in Indian government, which I thought was very wise. Thinking about sovereignty of data, it's more important to think about sovereignty of data not from the context of, is that data located in my country, but more, does my country have control over that data? Because in the internet, there aren't these geographic boundaries. And in the internet, the determination to maintain that data within your own country boundary can actually reduce the ability that we have and other vendors have to provide cybersecurity to you, and it exposes you to this greater physical security risk. But so the focus should instead be on how do we ensure that we have the control of the data that is our country's data, that's our critical infrastructure data, or our government data. How do we maintain that control? Which vendors can ensure us that we get the control of the data in the way that we want to have it? And think about sovereignty from that perspective rather than its physical location.
Thank you, Tom. My apologies to the guests on this side for not allowing to, enabling to take the questions because we have run out of time. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you all.